Okay, so I want to talk about how you got to be a sex at all. And before I do that, I want to make sure that I use these terms correctly. And it's not outside of the realm of the possibilities that I may actually use them incorrectly, because I'm still in the process of educating myself. So first, we need to acknowledge that the term sex and the term gender are totally different terms. So what sex is basically your biological traits, okay? There are at least, and nobody agrees on how many, but there are at least 5 different determinants of biological sex. There are your sex chromosomes, XX, XY, but then there are also variations in that. You guys may or may not know that there are XXY, X with no other chromosome, XO. There are XYY, and what are those? What sex do those end up being, those chromosomal combinations? So in addition to your sex chromosomes, there are your gonads, and the gonads are ovaries versus testes, but the ovaries and testes are the same embryological structure, and sometimes they don't completely decide to be one or the other. And then there are your sex hormones, and the sex hormones is, do you, after puberty, have more estrogens than androgens? Then typically your sex hormones are more typically female. Do you have more androgens, including testosterone, than estrogens? Then your hormones are more typically male. But then there are more. There's also your internal reproductive organs. Do you, for instance, have vas deferens, seminal vesicles, and a prostate gland? That's more typically male sex. Or do you have fallopian tubes, oviducts, right? And uterus. And then that's more typically female. And then there's your external genitalia. The external genitalia also has the same embryonic basis, but sometimes under certain hormonal environments, what could have been a clitoris develops into a penis. Under different hormonal environments, what could have been a penis develops into a clitoris. Okay, so that's all of the determinants of sex. And although a lot of people like to pretend that it's really, really simple, it's actually not very simple. And sometimes some of those develop and others don't develop. And so even determining the sex of an individual is not always black and white. Okay, but then gender is a different thing. Gender is your social identity. It has tremendous amounts to do with socialization and with how you fit into the social framework. And let's just be honest here, this is well outside of my realm of expertise. I just wanted to make sure that when I was talking about anatomical sex, I distinguished it from the social identity of gender. Because of course it's a question that comes up. It's not a question that I am the person to answer or that the answers even completely exist yet, but it's certainly something that is worth discussing. Okay. So let's talk about how you get to be a sex. So let's talk about the internal structure. So we're assuming XX and XY, right? Because we're in the anatomy phase. And unless I tell you otherwise, assume that we have a typical developing anatomical male and a typical developing anatomical female. So let's start with the internal reproductive structures. These are interesting. Okay, so first off, everybody had a period after fertilization in which they didn't have an anatomical sex at all. Now, they may have had a chromosomal sex that probably wasn't assessed, but generally not assessed before this. But before about 6 weeks or so, so this is 6 weeks post-implantation, so it's usually about 7 weeks after the fertilization occurred. So there is this sexually indifferent stage. And so this is like teeny tiny structures that we're talking about. So this is still embryo. So what you have is you have 2 different sets of ductwork, not quack quack, but the other kind. This pink ductwork right here and right here, if that continues development, what will happen is it will eventually develop into the fallopian tubes in the uterus, okay? Oviducts or uterine tubes and the uterus, okay? But every single person originally had the ability to make either that stuff or this stuff, right? And the purple ducts right here, called the mesonephric ducts, If those continue their development, they will develop into eventually the vas deferens or ductus deferens and the seminal vesicles, and then the prostate gland will develop out of those as well. Okay, so you had a sexually indifferent stage, and then differentiation actually started. Okay, so the internal ductwork, the purple ducts right here, okay, they were either called the mesonephric ducts or the Wolffian ducts, after the guy who found them. His name was Wolf with two F's. And Wolffian is usually a little easier for me to remember because in the cartoons the wolf was usually male. Those are the male ducts, so they're represented in purple here. Or these guys right here, which are called the paramesonephric ducts or the Mullerian ducts, because they were discovered by a guy named Muller. And if those continue development, they will develop into an anatomical female. This is all internal ductwork that you're dealing with, okay? So notice that you had the capacity to be either one. I'll tell you how your typical chromosomal complement will make you go one way or the other in just a second, but I just want to get the structures down. So this is the internal reproductive organ development. And then let's talk about the external genitalia. Oh, wait, hold on just a second. Oh, yeah. Okay, so the other homologous structures that we are talking about. Okay, all right, so I don't know if everybody knows the term homologous structures, so let me introduce you to this term right here. Homologous structures, right here. Homo as in the same, this is not homo anything except that they are derived from the same embryonic structure. So, for instance, my arm and a bird wing are homologous structures, right? So they're derived from the same embryonic structures. If you follow them back, you can watch them develop through embryology. So some homologous structures that exist. So these guys right here, before we go any further, one of the things that I want you to understand is that this structure right here, before it's formed, before it's decided, it's called the genital ridge. It will form either the ovaries or the testes, because the ovaries and the testes are homologous structures. They originate from the same embryological structure under different hormonal environments. What will generally happen, of course, is the testes will actually start to move down through the inguinal canal at about 7 months post-implantation. But there are some other homologous structures that you may have never learned before. I didn't learn them when I was in school until I was in college, and I don't even think I learned them in my anatomy class. Okay, so the other homologous structures are these. Everything in this figure that's represented as the same color on the female and the male will be a homologous structure. Okay, so the glans penis right here, which is the tip of the penis right there, is the same structure as the glans clitoris, which is the tip of the clitoris, okay? The scrotum right here is the same structure as the labia majora, okay? One that I didn't write in here, but let me go ahead and put it in here. The skin that covers the shaft of the penis is the same structure as the labia minora as well, okay? So what happens is, again, indifferent until week 5 or 6, and then you will start to develop one direction or the other, okay? If you do not completely develop one way or the other, then they will have an anatomy that is reminiscent of both sexes, and generally speaking, that's referred to as intersex. Okay, so let's look at how these homologous structures are differentiated into a typical anatomical female or a typical anatomical male. So the first thing that happens is just that one of the sexes has a Y chromosome and the other one does not have a Y chromosome, right? So there is a gene on the Y chromosome. It's a gene called SRY. So just stick with me for a second so that I can actually explain to you how this works. I tried to look at an animation or find an animation, but they didn't have one. So there's an SRY gene that's on the Y chromosome, and of course only one chromosomal sex has the Y chromosome, typically speaking. And that gene turns on at 5 to 6 weeks gestation, so right before all of this occurs. And when that gene turns on, what should happen is that if that gene turns on, you'll start going down this pathway. If that gene does not turn on, you'll start going down this pathway. So interestingly, nipples actually form before weeks 5 or 6, which is why both anatomical sexes have nipples, even though, of course, both anatomical sexes generally cannot lactate. So nipples develop before sexual differentiation actually occurs. So the other things that occur after this is, so you actually sort of started going down this path. Then, as you decided these were going to be testes and not ovaries, now they will produce a hormone called MIH, or sometimes MIS, Mullerian inhibiting hormone. Mullerian inhibiting hormone will actually be produced by these after they decide to become testes. And then what it will cause is the degeneration of the Mullerian ducts. So Mullerian inhibiting hormone. Does that make sense? Mullerian inhibiting hormone. So you turned the testes into testes, and then the testes inactivated the Mullerian ducts. So in the males, you have a two-step process in order to have a typical anatomical development of males. So Mullerian inhibiting hormone actually causes degeneration of the Mullerian ducts, and it arrests the development of anything that would have become fallopian tubes, a uterus, the upper portion of the vagina. Okay, so, and then placental hormones will cause the fetus to secrete sex hormones during pregnancy. And so one of the things that we've figured out is really the default pathway in humans is to develop down the female pathway. If you do not flip these two switches, the SRY and then the MIH, you are going to develop as an anatomical female. If you flip one of the switches and not the other, you're going to develop something that's not a typical anatomical either sex. Okay, so what is going to happen a little bit later is we have figured out that once you start getting going, the XX fetal gonads, these, which would typically be developed female, will secrete estrogen, and estrogen will say, yeah, continue developing all of this female-like stuff. And the XY fetal gonads will secrete testosterone, and it'll say, yeah, continue developing all of that male-like stuff. And one of the things that they figured out accidentally at first is if you give an XX fetus too much testosterone during development, then you can start development of the male ducts because you never really turned them off. So anatomic maleness is actually the presence of testosterone. Anatomic femaleness is not the presence of estrogen. You do need estrogen to get it to completely develop, but it's the absence of testosterone that actually makes you complete this pathway. And the evidence that we ran into that showed us this is that if a pregnant woman is injected with testosterone, like people who use testosterone to build muscle mass, there are women who do that. At exactly the right/wrong moment in development, you can flip an XX fetus to developing more typically anatomical male. Now, I'm not saying they will ever be a fertile anatomical male, but I can say that you can cause enough confusion that you can actually get continued development of the Wolffian ducts externally. And what can happen as well is if you inject a woman with an XX fetus with too much testosterone at a certain point of development, the external genitalia will go from looking like this to looking like this. This is the default in humans. So the other thing that we know is that if there is an XY fetus and their testosterone receptors don't work, it's called androgen insensitivity syndrome, then what happens is you get this strange little combination to sort of bring this all back together with you. So let's talk about what would happen potentially if you had an XY fetus, but the testosterone receptors or androgen receptors don't work. So remember that in order to make a typical anatomical male, you need two switches to flip. The first switch was SRY, that causes development of the gonads to become more like testes. But and that worked, right? So you're going to tell them that they're going to become testes. And then the next switch right here is that the MIH will cause disintegration of the Mullerian ducts, and that works. But these guys try to produce testosterone, and they do produce testosterone to cause the continued development of the male reproductive tract, but the male is insensitive to that. The fetus is insensitive to that. So what happens is you try to get all of this started with testosterone, but it doesn't actually continue the development. So you told them they were testes, but they had no motivation to start doing testes things. And so they didn't move down. In addition, all of this is the default. This will only happen in the presence and the response to testosterone. So this doesn't happen. So the external genitalia looks more like this. But you also didn't have estrogen during the right time. So what you did is you kind of disintegrated the Mullerian ducts and then never continued the development of the Wolffian ducts. So you still have the blind vagina. You don't really have a uterus. It's a blind vagina that kind of ends where the cervix ends. It's actually a little shallower than most vaginas. And you've got these gonads that are up there in the peritoneal cavity, like gonads are, and they never actually develop into functioning testes or functioning ovaries. So this baby is born and they've got internal ductwork that is more female than male but doesn't have a uterus, and they've got external genitalia that look like this. So they get named a girl's name because you don't generally go looking for a uterus. They get raised as girls, and they have androgen insensitivity syndrome. Of course, they're infertile. Later on, when they're supposed to hit puberty, is generally when someone will notice that they don't menstruate. And then, if they get taken to the doctor, somebody will notice that they have a blind vagina and no uterus, right? Then, typically speaking, somebody is going to have to tell this person, who's 13, 15, I don't know, that they are XY and that they were supposed to be male even though they've been raised female their entire life. And then they need surgery because those undifferentiated gonads have a really high incidence of cancer. And then after they have surgery, they're going to have to replace estrogen for the rest of their life. Oh, I forgot to tell you one little tidbit. If you produce testosterone and you don't respond to it, estrogen is made from testosterone, so you'll just flip it into estrogen. So kind of interesting. That'll happen after puberty. That is androgen insensitivity syndrome, and it kind of throws up in the air everybody's idea that, like, oh, sex differentiation is super simple, because it's really not that simple. Okay, so after birth, let's say you have a typical anatomical male or a typical anatomical female. What happens with all of this stuff until puberty? Not much, really. Basically, it's all put in place. Those are called the primary sex characteristics. And then they just kind of stay there and don't really do much until you hit puberty. And then at puberty, those of you guys who have had a little fizz know this, there's a hormone that's produced from the hypothalamus. It's called GnRH. GnRH will turn all of this machinery on again. So it causes the gonads to now, if they are ovaries, they will start producing estrogens and progesterone. And if they're testes, they're going to start producing androgens, including testosterone. And then you're going to see all of the secondary sex characteristics. And the secondary sex characteristics are breast development in females, height increase in both, changes in body fat composition, hair growth, sex drive, all of that kind of stuff that's related. Puberty becomes noticeable at that point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about clinical connections and terminology, and then I will finish this part, and I'll start on female reproductive system anatomy in the next lecture, which I'll post later this week. Okay, so let's talk about what we know and what we don't know about brain gender determination. So all of this business that we were talking about is anatomical sex determination, right? So what do we know about whether a person gender identifies as male or female? Not as much as we want to know. So I'll tell you that there is some preliminary evidence that suggests that gender determination does not occur entirely differently than sex determination, but it also doesn't occur at the same time. So some preliminary evidence indicates from other animal models, because you can't really experiment on humans, well, no, it's actually from humans. Sorry, it was the sex determination that was from other animals. Preliminary evidence suggests that gender determination may occur independently at a different time of sex determination, and that it may occur in the last half of pregnancy. And interestingly, the whole androgen insensitivity syndrome really kind of throws a monkey wrench in that gender determination is XXXY and all that kind of stuff. So because with androgen insensitivity syndrome, they of course develop with female-looking external reproductive structures, and they're generally named Susie or whatever, but most of these people gender identifies female, even though they have high levels of testosterone in their XY, which made us wonder whether gender determination is not related to the response to testosterone. But it's still relatively unknown, and the experimentation that's gone on is mostly in people, or not experimentation, the analysis that's gone on in mostly people who are, let's see if I can get this right. I won't test you over this part, but I just think it's super interesting. And it's also discussed in that activity that I linked at the end. It's mostly gone on in, I think, people who are female to male transgender, and very little who are the other way around. So anyway, gender determination does not necessarily align with sex determination, is what I'm telling you. So what about the sexes? Are there only male and female, truly, like your grandpa tells you? They're not. I'm sorry. There is a lot of variation in sexes, because I just showed you one of them, right? This person who has androgen insensitivity has a blind vagina and no uterus, but they're XY with high levels of testosterone, but they gender identify as female. So they're a male, they're a female, and then there is anatomy that is neither typical male nor female. And this is typically referred to as intersex. Okay, it's not the same thing as cis or transgender. We'll talk about that in just a second. So there's anatomic variance between male and female, and there's intersex. And there's a decent amount of intersex people. Anatomic ambiguity can occur anywhere in here. It could occur chromosomally, hormonally, and then the actual anatomy internally or externally. Okay, and then genders. So gender is your identification, your social identification. Me thinking I am female and having a body that looks relatively female is typically referred to as someone who is cisgender. And cis, you guys studied chemistry enough to know that cis is like kind of the same side and trans is on the opposite side. And individuals who identify as transgender feel like their gender doesn't match their anatomic sex. And of course the gender aligns with their own internal psychological determination. It's independent of your anatomical or physiological determination. So you're considered cis by this terminology if your gender matches your anatomical sex. You are considered trans by this terminology if your gender does not match your anatomical sex. And there are some interesting anatomical and gender variants that are discussed in that activity at the end, which was primarily about deciding which Olympic athletes could, or which athletes could compete under which circumstances. And then, of course, what's sexual orientation? Well, it's not anything that I'm an expert on at all, but it's a separate issue than cis or trans or intersex or anything like that. So sexual orientation is the person that you are attracted to. It's not what you are anatomically. It's not what you identify as. It's not any of that stuff. It's the person that you are attracted to sexually. And of course, there's also asexual, means you're not attracted to anyone sexually. So a person who is typical anatomical male, female, typical anatomical male or female, or intersex, transgender or cisgender people can be attracted to someone that is any of those things as well. And people can fall anywhere along the spectrum of sexual orientation. Sort of a famous psychological thing is the Kinsey Scale. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Kinsey Scale. And I guess that, again, this is definitely traveling outside of the realm of anatomy, but it's kind of interesting. It was done all the way back in 1948, then it was done again in 1953. Whether you think the science is strong or not, most social sciences have a little iffy scientific background. But it did ask people anonymously where they fell along the spectrum from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. And then now there's asexual over on this end. And believe it or not, there weren't that many zeros and there weren't that many sixes. So most people fall somewhere between 0 and 6. Anyway, so that is the whole background of how you got to be a sex at all, with a couple of other things that people generally ask me about. In the next lecture, I will go through female reproductive system anatomy and male reproductive system anatomy. And here I'm just going to assume that everything is really typical anatomical female and typical anatomical male, even though that we know that that's not always the case. Okay, I will see you guys very soon.